Welcome back. Well, we've got one of our top stories for this evening. Trucks on fire, looted shops and roads blocked. That's been the reality in parts of KwaZulu-Natal. The N3 from Durban to Johannesburg has been closed due to apparent pro-Zuma protests. It's open now, but demonstrations have now spilled into Gauteng. ANC KZN chairperson Sihle Zikalala says Jacob Zuma's imprisonment will cost the ANC come the October elections. Political analyst Ongama Mtimka joins me now for this matter. Ongama, certainly interesting times that we find ourselves in the South African context. One says that it is our democratic right to protest, especially where we feel unhappy. At this moment in time, as you're watching what's currently transpiring between KZN as well as Gauteng, what do we make of the situation? Could we find ourselves in a conundrum as a country and a socio-economic tipping point?
I doubt it will get to that level, but it's not ignorable either. I mean, if you look at the damages that happened suffered by the road freight sector, they are a cause for concern. But it is not, you see, when you manage political risks, it is not the risks themselves that should make they should not lead to paralysis when it comes to taking the right corrective action. So, for example, a question people have been asking is, could we not have anticipated that things were going to get to this level? And people ask that question to suggest that action should not have been taken against former President Jacob Zuma. My view is that you assess political risks, you determine what the likely probability is and what impact it will be, and generally that ought not to lead to non-action. And I think that part of the price we need to pay, Faith, in order for us to get to a political environment where there's a general sense of commitment to the rule of law, justice, we have to go past these impediments.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking here about paralysis, instead of intervening quite swiftly, especially in light of these protests. But is the KZN government, for example, suffering from such a paralysis? Sihle Zikalala saying that maybe, calling for calm in many aspects, saying that he's reached out to, the national body of the African National Congress today, deploying the MECs for that intervention strategy along the N3. But is it enough? And is he suffering from paralysis at this time? Because a lot of South Africans are calling for strong leadership.
Yeah, we've got to be careful about those calls for a lot stronger interventions. Strong leadership, absolutely. And there's a twofold manifestation of this problem. One, there's the party political mobilization, which is done by a faction that is disgruntled by the direction that the country is taking. And then there's also a policing problem. Police need to be present enough and swift enough to respond in equal measure to the threat that we are facing without precipitating another crisis. If you look at the nature of attacks that are being waged, there's a deliberate intention to make these violent. Now, when police respond to this, they cannot respond with violence willy-nilly, because that's part of the political game. It's to frame the regime as being uncaring, as being prone to violence against black people. So the regime has got everything to lose, while the protesters have got nothing to lose. So indeed, the activities of making sure that people are arrested swiftly are good. And unfortunately, even with the best intelligence, some of the good practice is to actually wait for people to start committing things or to be in the process of committing things. Otherwise, there will be a very fine line between political persecution and effective policing.
And if that were not enough, now we've got to contend with a Delta variant that is spreading rapidly, COVID-19 infections that are on an increasing rise. We're finding ourselves in such almost like a balancing act in this country where once again the question of livelihoods versus lives come into the play. President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to address us at 8 p.m. this evening. Surely, as much as he's going to speak about COVID-19, he cannot ignore the pink elephant in the room at this point.
Yeah, and I think that it's time that we debate lockdowns as effective mechanisms of dealing with the pandemic. One, you can understand when measures are undertaken to prevent the overcrowding of hospitals. But lockdowns and their efficacy thereof need to be looked at. First of all, because of the other destruction that they cause and the sort of permanent impact that it creates for people losing their jobs, businesses going under, without an equivalent response on the part of the state, which sort of brings a reprieve to those businesses and employees that lose their source of income. And it's not light because it doesn't lead directly to deaths as COVID it does. Because you remember, it may be indirect, but actually there may be a lot of things like suicides, for example, that result as people lose their jobs and are not able to provide for their families. And people's futures may be at stake because remember, for every job, there are about 4 to 5 people that depend on that income minimum. And so careers could also be ruined by the fact that people suddenly lose income and can no longer afford to take their children to the schools that they do, or accord their families good social health care, among other things.
Yeah. Now, of course, the stakes are high at this point, Ongama. So given how high the stakes are, can this country afford an extension of level 4 lockdown with the current restrictions that are in place?
That's precisely the point I'm making. So if you think about it, just the restaurant sector, those people who are not going to offices have used restaurants as meeting places for customers, given how they would be preferred compared to homes, for example. Now, when you act against, when you bar that activity, it's not just the sales that happen in terms of people eating and all of those things, but also all the business activities that get to be done within that sector alone. And that's just one. There are direct and indirect consequences for every economic sector, socio-economic sector, by the way, that gets affected by lockdown.
We'll leave it there. That's Ongama Mtimka, political analyst, just giving us almost a preview of what we're anticipating for this evening, but perhaps looking at whether or not the country at this point in time can actually afford to go into an extended level 4 lockdown. While speaking